This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what good news do you have for us today?
I have no good news, Danny.
Exactly.
We are discussing the collapse of trust in our institutions. We are experiencing a crisis of trust. There's new polling out from Gallup, which has been tracking these numbers since the 1970s, and collapse in trust in the federal government, big business, the media, education, science and medicine, technology, religious institutions, law enforcement. All of these institutions, you name it, is collapsing. Gallup tracks 16 institutions, and over the past decade, 11 of those institutions have recorded their lowest ever popular support in the last couple of years. The only institutions that have held steady and have enjoyed majority confidence are the military and small business. Every other institution has absolutely collapsed. Jerry Baker of the Wall Street Journal has written a fantastic essay in the Wall Street Journal based on his new book about this, diagnosing the problem, explaining to us why this collapse is happening, and we've got him on the pod today.
Exactly. So a lot of people, I think, paid attention to also the Pew poll that came out last week. And I'm not going to read everybody the litany of it, but fewer than 2 in 10 Americans say they trust the government in Washington to do what is right just about always, or even most of the time. Now, again, I think skepticism about government is an American trait, right?
Yes.
This is one of the reasons why we have a representative democracy, right? You want to be able to throw the bums out every 4 years, every 2 years, every 6 years. But I think the problem is actually deeper than the one that Pew and Gallup lay bare. It is not simply that Americans don't trust what used to be the pillars of our society and our community, not simply government, but local government, but they don't trust their neighbors anymore. Okay, they don't trust their hometown newspaper anymore. They don't trust the man or woman who they're used to seeing on the news, and this is so corrosive. We didn't use this word during the podcast, but it is actually the one that kept coming to mind. It's so atomizing. We are increasingly alone. One of the things that I love about Americans is, we all get together and, believe we do the right thing. We believe in the future. We believe in the rewards and the fruits of hard work. We believe in faith, family, and community. Nah, we're not those people anymore.
Well, but we still want to be. So a couple of weeks ago, we had my Washington Post colleague, Alyssa Rosenberg, on the podcast with me because we had done a joint essay in the Washington Post. Alyssa is about as liberal as you could possibly be, pro-choice liberal. I'm a pro-life conservative. And we did an essay on what we agreed on family policy and how we could learn to put aside our differences on abortion and come together. And the response to that essay that we've been getting is so heartening, and it wasn't even so much the substance of it, though I think the substance is important, but the existence of the exercise, the fact that two of us who disagree so much decided to come together, trust each other, work together, reach across the aisle, and try to find some common ground. And I think there's a hunger for that in America, for people to do that. And it was just, what's sad is that it was so unusual what Alyssa and I did with that piece. But it was, I think there's a hunger for that in America. If someone can come out and tap into it.
There is, Mark, but a lot of it is performative. The bottom line is that, yes, of course, you and Alyssa, two members of an elite class of columnists for the Washington Post, got together. You beat the trend, but bottom line is that even in households, Americans used to know a lot of people who voted differently from them. At some point, in not too far away ago podcast, we discussed the fact that Democrats don't actually know Republicans. They're able to objectify them, to dehumanize them, because they don't actually know them. And even that is just something that is so intensely depressing. But I mean, we all do have friends who are Democrats, but look at our core group. We're all Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. And one of the things we talk about with Jerry is the fact that, numbers show that 35 million Americans have moved, many of them from blue states to red states or from red states to blue states. They're moving. That's almost, 1 in 10 Americans
voting with their feet.
And some of them are just moving because there's economic opportunity, but some of them are moving because they just don't want to be around those people anymore. And they don't want their policies. They don't feel they're being listened to in their states. And so they're moving to places where they'll have better policies. But the result is we're living in ideological silos. We don't know people, as you say, who disagree with each other. But also there's a broader trend. Let's not put this blame entirely on people, individuals. Let's talk about the institutions, because the institutions have done this to themselves. Jerry does a very good job in his book, in his essay, of just doing the litany of failure. And they're bipartisan, by the way. You've got the failure to find WMD in Iraq, which caused a lot of lack of trust in our political leaders. Then you got the Russia collusion conspiracy theory when Trump was elected, which turned out to be nothing more than a conspiracy theory. You got Trump, with his stolen election claims in 2020. You've got the COVID pandemic, where everyone told us we had to lock down and keep kids out of schools, and all of a sudden it turned out that wasn't the case. We got so much bad information.
What you're trying to say is we may not trust them, but they've earned it.
Exactly.
Well,
yes. So, I mean, all these institutions, our public health institutions, our political leaders on both sides of the aisle, the news media, they've all earned this. They've done this. And so it's not surprising that people don't trust each other. And then what happens is they go for alternate sources of information because they don't trust the media. But then we're talking about, people who have their own sets of facts.
Right.
Everybody I know thinks the election was stolen. So why should it must have been stolen, because the Washington Post and the New York Times tell me it wasn't. So I don't trust them. And I trust my local radio talk show host a lot more than them or Donald Trump. So, it becomes a vicious cycle.
I agree with you. I want to, before we go to the interview with Jerry, in which we talk a lot about this, I want to inject one more current events note that I think is really important to this collapse, and that is the collapse of decorum. Now, we haven't talked about the poor Senator John Fetterman, who should be a man who is recovering and doing occupational therapy and spending more time with his family, as opposed to feeling like the thing that needs to liberate him is that he really needs to wear shorts and a sweatshirt to the Senate. Now, who gives a damn? Go there in your underwear if you want. Okay, it's about leadership.
I give a damn.
Well, no, but let me finish. Hang on a second. Objectively speaking, of course, the Senate is about governance. You can vote and govern theoretically as well in a sweatshirt as you can in a suit jacket. That's not the issue here. The issue here is that Fetterman is the cherry on top of the sundae of the loss of decorum in our country. It is, Mark, when I wrote a piece about how I might have to vote for Donald Trump in the Washington Post, because I believed in the institutions that needed to be preserved from what the Democrats were threatening, there were more than 23,000 comments. And let me tell you something. Once you call somebody the things that people consistently called me in those comments, you can't step back, right? You cannot call, sorry everybody, warning, you cannot call somebody a fucking scumbag who is destroying our nation and then turn around the next day and go, hey, I really want to talk to you about what you think about this. This collapse in the ability to be able to disagree politely, right? We're seeing this now in my native Australia, where they're voting on an indigenous, quote unquote, voice, sort of a parallel government structure for Aboriginal First Nation people there. And if you want to vote no, and I am voting no, if you want to vote no, The answer is not, oh, yes, well, we do have a legitimate disagreement about whether this is a good choice for Australia. It is, you are a racist and a white supremacist, and that's the only reason you vote no. You can't talk to somebody who calls you that. So, we go from the sweatshirt, which is just, a little peek at the problem, and you get down to that. If you are willing to call somebody a white supremacist because you disagree with them about politics, it's done. You can't find common ground. You can't be you and Alyssa.
I agree with that. I think that the idea that that someone is going to go into the greatest deliberative body on the face of the earth, even now, despite all the everything that's happened, and can't put on a suit and tie to do that, is emblematic of everything that's wrong with our institutions. People don't trust our institutions, so let's dumb them down just a little bit further. And yeah, you're right. It doesn't matter in a sense, but it does, because decorum matters, and it's a sign of disrespect for the institution, right? The problem we have in America is not that people respect the Senate too much, and we ought to chip away at that a little bit more. It's that they don't respect the Senate enough, they don't respect the institution enough, and so let's not dumb it down a little bit more. It's a symptom, not the cause.
And very visual and evocative. So our interview, Jerry Baker, we've had him on before, is the editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal. He's also the host of the Wall Street Journal at Large with Jerry Baker on Fox Business and the weekly Wall Street Journal opinion podcast, Free Expression. He's been with the Journal. He's been with Dow Jones. He's been with the Financial Times, the Times of London, and the BBC. Most importantly, he is the author of a new book called American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions and How We Can Rebuild Confidence.
Here's our interview. Well, Jerry, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you both. Thanks for having me again. I enjoyed listening to your podcast, and I enjoy even more talking on it.
Well, great. Well, we're thrilled to have you, and particularly because you had a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal, which, as I understand, is coming out as a book, talking about the collapse of trust in our institutions. We have a crisis of trust in our institutions. First of all, just describe this crisis of trust that we're experiencing. I think a lot of people feel it, but you've actually documented it.
Yeah, Mark, well, thank you very much. Indeed, the book was just published just a week or so ago, and thank you for noticing the article in the Journal. Yeah, the basic thrust of the book. I tell you what, actually, I started doing this book. I've lived in this country for 25, almost 30 years. Came here in the 1990s when America was, right at the peak, the pinnacle of its power, post-Cold War, everything, the end of history. We were all going to be we're going to be liberal Democrats and, be one version or another of American democracy. And, it was great. I thought it was, I agreed with most of that. And then over that, since as a journalist here, I worked for the Financial Times and ultimately for the Wall Street Journal. I got a sort of close-hand look at the decline, shall we say, the decline from that pinnacle. And I wanted to write a book which would sort of try and analyze this and anatomize this, figure out what had gone wrong, what's taken us from a situation 30 years ago where, again, America was the kind of acme of human achievement and success to this position we're in today. And as I looked at it in detail, it struck me that the institutions that, as a journalist, I'd covered and that as a newspaper, the Wall Street Journal covered, started to look more closely at what had happened and the way in which people related to those institutions. And then I went away and looked up a lot of data. There's a tremendous amount of polling data, survey data. Gallup does a poll all the time. Every year, Pew does too. Which measures the level of public trust in the major institutions in America. And this is where I really sort of got the idea for the book. And it is astonishing because they've been doing this for about 50 years. Gallup have been measuring this since the 1970s. And in the last 10 years or so, 15 or 16 major institutions, the government, the federal government, the judiciary, big business, the media, universities, education generally, various other institutions. And in every single one, with the exception of two, which we can talk about, public trust in those institutions has not only declined, it's collapsed. In almost all of them, it's come down from, very high levels of trust in the 80s, 90s in particular, down to really, shockingly low levels of trust today. The perfect example, I'm ashamed to say, and you won't be surprised to hear, is the media. The media back in the 1980s, People had a level of trust. It was the post-Watergate glow that people had a level of trust in news organizations up in the 70+% range. More than 3/4 of Americans said they trusted the news. Today, that number is down at about 15%. It's the same, but that's the most extreme example, but it's the same with big business, with the federal government, with education, higher education, with technology companies, with the technology that we use, with public health, with science and medicine. All of these key institutions that make up, obviously, the civic and political and cultural leadership of the country, people don't trust them anymore. They've gone from being trusted to untrusted in the space of a generation. And that's what I look at it. And by the way, one other thing, very alarmingly too, is that Americans don't trust each other anymore. Again, 30 years ago, Americans, generally speaking, trusted each other to tell the truth, to do the right thing, to look out for, to do good for the country. They don't trust each other anymore to do that. They have very low levels of trust in each other. So I wanted to look at this in detail, figure out what had gone wrong with all of these institutions, and try to draw out some general conclusions about what had happened that leaves us in this really, really, I think, perilous situation where the vast majority of the American people do not trust the major institutions and the leadership of the country.
So you've delivered the bad news. I don't think it's going to come as a surprise to, certainly not surprising to us. I don't think it'll be a surprise to our listeners. I think everybody not simply knows this factually, but feels it instinctively as well. What's the answer? Why?
So, yeah, good question. You'll have to read the book to find out. You'll have to buy and read the book to find out. But no, the answer is, so first of all, I mean, again, all of these institutions have seen catastrophic declines in levels of trust. And, like Tolstoy's unhappy families, they're all untrusted in their own way. They all have particular reasons why people have come not to trust them. The government, I think the federal government, I think that's partly a record of failure over the last 20 years, whether domestically relatively weak economic growth, internationally, the sense that, we can disagree about this, but wars that have not gone well, foreign policy that's left America weaker, big business. There've been scandals that have undermined trust in big business. The global financial crisis played a big role in that. All of these institutions have their own particular reasons, but I think there are some common factors that explain this broad, across the board level of decline in levels of trust. And I think, I think there are things like I think it is to do with. Obviously, partisanship has become such a huge phenomenon, polarization. And you find with a lot of these institutions that there's polarized levels of distrust. The medical establishment is a very good example, or science. In the last 5 years, particularly post-COVID, Republicans tend to be very distrustful now of medical science, whereas Democrats still have relatively high levels of trust. So polarization. But what's interesting, Mark and Danny, is that even if, so it's not just that Democrats don't trust the federal government when the Republicans are in charge, or Republicans don't trust the federal government when Democrats are in charge. Both of them, I mean, they have higher levels of trust when their party's in charge, but both parties record much lower levels of trust in their government than they did 30, 40 years ago. So again, I think there's individual reasons, but I think one is what polarization has been a huge factor, obviously. Secondly, I do think the rise of economic inequality. I think a country that has seen the kind of inequality that has arisen in the United States in the last 30 years is intrinsically, if you like, vociferous. It's creating tensions. It's creating gaps in essentially in the way in which people relate to each other, review each other, and I think it does create mistrust. What interesting, I quite a lot of interesting polling data. In the past, Americans broadly tolerated the inequalities we had in the past because they thought it was justified, it was deserved. If you made a lot of money in America, it was the American dream. You deserved it. You worked hard. You had talent. You got educated, you made a business, you built a business, you went and you were successful, you deserved it. Now polling suggests people do not see do not have the same level of trust in the system itself. They think the system is rigged. And by the way, if you look at, this has come out in the context of the discussion about things like affirmative action in American colleges in the last 6 months. If you look at the social mobility today of Americans, it is way down. The people who go to the top universities in this country, the Ivy League and the top 20 or 30 universities, tend to come from a very, very narrow economic class. It's a narrower and narrower economic class. And that's seen as the opportunity to achieve great success. So I think that the sense of injustice, of inequality is very profound. But I think the most important reason, and neither of you will be surprised to hear this, and I've written about this a lot, is is the fact that most of these institutions have been captured by an ideological elite, a sort of they call themselves progressive, an ideological elite, which actually doesn't really believe in the values that actually made America great, made America the country that it is, and actually aren't the values that most Americans actually espouse. And we've seen this particularly in the last few years, but it's true whether it's big business, whether it's the media, whether it's colleges, whether it's the permanent government, whether it's science and technology, this new establishment, if you like, which emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, but particularly after the end of the Cold War, committed to a set of values that are actually fundamentally not just un-American, but actually anti-American. They actually believe, and that I'm not sort of putting words. I'm not being unkind to them there. They don't really believe in that America, the traditional American way, is the right way. And I think it's that more than anything. People see that these institutions have just become so far detached from the values and the ideals that they hold, that means very understandably that they don't trust them anymore.
So talk a little bit about the vicious cycle that we seem to be in. So you've had this collapse of institutions and trust in institutions. And then in 2016, you had this populist uprising of the people who've sort of been on the losing end of this rising inequality and who didn't trust the institutions. And so they elected this guy, Donald Trump, to go in like a bull in a china shop into, start breaking the china on their behalf. And the elites responded by the Russia collusion conspiracy theory to, the multiple, I think 91 indictments were up to now with Trump. Many of them deserved, but there seems to be this vicious cycle where the people who are on the losing end have risen up to say, we demand to be heard, we demand to be addressed. And the elites have responded by trying to tamp them down and destroy their movement. And the distrust gets worse and worse. Is that a fair description of what's happening in our politics right now?
Yeah, I think it is, Mark. I think it's a good point. And let me say this because you and I both know, and I don't think either of you are either. I'm no fan of Donald Trump. So, and I
exactly.
think that. But I tell you what, I think Donald Trump's election in 2016 is largely explicable by this sense of alienation and this lack of trust that people have in the major institutions. Trump came along because it was a bipartisan thing. Let's be honest. Again, a lot of Republicans were very unhappy with what Republicans in Congress had done or what Republican administrations had done. It was a bipartisan thing, a sense that nobody out there is listening to us. Nobody out there, shares our values, shares our ideals. Then along comes this bull in a china shop, as you describe him, who says things that a lot of Americans believe and have been told that they're not really kind of allowed to believe, whether it's about immigration or about America's role in the world or about cultural issues, about what's happening, about this extraordinary pace of cultural change that we're seeing in America. And they embrace him and they say, yeah, okay. And I think that's why he gets elected. Now, I think you're right, Mark. I think then the establishment pushes back, comes up with the Russia story, but also pushes back in 1,000 different ways. I do think, the permanent government, when Trump was in power, and again, I don't admire everything Trump did, and I certainly don't admire everything Trump said, but I don't think there's any question that through his 4 years in power, whether it was from intelligence agencies, from law enforcement, from the bureaucracy in Washington, there was active undermining of everything he was doing, whether it was slow rolling what he was trying to do, or whether it was constantly leaking to the press supposedly outrageous things that he was doing. So there was this pushback. All that said, and so that further, you're absolutely right, further kind of contributes to this cycle of distrust. All that said, Trump himself contributed to it. I mean, one of the, I don't think there's, I think, one of the things I say in the book is that, we have, when you don't, trust is so essential, right? And we haven't talked about this, but trust in your institutions is trust in everything is so essential in order to be able, for a society to be able to succeed. You can't, for a democracy to succeed, you cannot have a situation where people don't trust what their leaders are doing, what their government is doing. And, the most extreme example of this distrust is that we have a situation today where I think it's right. I think the vast majority of Republicans, and therefore almost half of the country, doesn't believe the last election was fairly decided. It believes the last election was stolen. That's the ultimate expression of distrust, when you don't believe that the person who holds office now in a democratically elected system was democratically elected. I don't share that view. I think there were lots of question marks that are reasonable to raise about the conduct of the 2020 election, but I do not believe the election was stolen. And so Trump, I think, has contributed to that trust, has fed that mistrust, and in that sense is also contributing to this vicious cycle.
So, Jerry, in this vicious cycle, the institution you point out that has lost the greatest amount of trust is the institution that you and I both work in, which is the newspapers. Went from, in 1979, 51% trust to just 18% today. And it seems, again, like this vicious cycle is taking place where, the media covered this Russia collusion conspiracy theory and presented it like truth. And then it turned out to be nothing more than a conspiracy theory. And then, like the boy who cried wolf, they said so many things about Trump that were wrong that when Trump actually comes out and lies and says the election is stolen, nobody believes him because we don't have a neutral arbiter of truth anymore that people trust. And so it's not surprising that so many Republicans believe the election is stolen because they've been lied to so many times. We'll never get to the point where we had with Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. I don't think we'll ever get that. But how does the media dig itself out of this hole? And do they even recognize that they've created this hole for themselves? And why?
Well, I don't think they really do recognize. I mean, there's still this. I'm struck still by the way in which the media cover Trump in particular. Many of them, as though he is this sort of monster that kind of came out of nowhere without realizing their own role in having basically created the conditions in which he could arise. They continue to do. I don't see any signs of self-awareness on the part of the media. Most of the media, I should obviously accept my own organization, the Wall Street Journal, which I think very largely sticks to. We have a conservative editorial page, obviously, but the news pages continue to work very hard to be objective. Look, I think, and by the way, you hear all this talk in the media, but they even reject the idea of objectivity. They don't even think they need to be objective anymore. It's about moral clarity. So they're in a very, very, very deep hole. I think it's exacerbated by the commercial conditions that they find themselves in. I don't have any doubt that, as advertising fell away as a major source of revenue for newspapers, particularly, but obviously for television too, but newspapers sought to replace that. Certainly the big newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, sought to replace that revenue, that advertising revenue, with subscriber revenue. And when you have subscribers, you're selling up a particular product directly to a group of people who have a particular reason that you want to give them a particular reason to buy that product. Whereas in the past, advertising was just, you were funded by advertising, which kind of everybody saw, and it didn't really require a particular viewpoint. Subscribers really require a viewpoint. They want, if they subscribe to the New York Times, the New York Times has tapped into the 5, 7, 8 million people in America who want a daily dose of, progressive, liberal, left, anti-Trump journalism. That's, and they do that, and that's the commercial imperative that's driving it. So I think not only is it a cultural thing where these newspapers have largely been taken over by this sort of new generation of highly ideological, highly motivated, Ivy League educated people who want to, tell us how we should live our lives. It's also a commercial thing, which is the commercial model is driving it. So no, I'm not very optimistic that will change. I think, if I have any optimism at all on this, and I do, it's that there are, in some respects, we have been here before, right? I mean, the idea of newspapers or a news media that strives to be completely objective is a relatively new thing. Within certainly the last 50, maybe the last century, in the middle of the 20th century, it really grew up. In the 19th century, America had these highly partisan newspapers, news organizations that, you can still see it in some of the names of the papers, the Democrat Gazette or the Republican Journal or whatever you see in places across the country. So we had that before. We had a highly, and you go back, and I look at some of the newspaper coverage, of the 1800 presidential election or of the, of some of those early debates around that time. It was extraordinarily partisan, and there were, vicious attacks on candidates from each side, and very reminiscent of the way that you see with Donald Trump today. What happened, I think, in the, late, the Wall Street Journal actually began this in the late 19th century. People decided they needed news they could trust. People had to have news that they could trust. They couldn't just any longer rely on a partisan take for what was going on in the world. For all kinds of reasons, they wanted to have news that they could trust. And so they started to turn towards news organizations that promised them not hyper-partisan news, but something that was going to be at least an attempt to strive towards giving them the facts of what was actually going on. So, and I think, so there's a chance that this could be a cyclical thing. We might turn again, and there will be a demand at some point for people to say, you know what, I just can't take any more of this, whether it's from the left or the right, just this constant. I don't want to have The news we have today largely confirms people's biases and prejudices, right? It's not really there to challenge people or to tell people facts that they don't want to hear. It's to tell people facts that they actually will confirm what they already think they believe. So I think there's a chance that will change as people start to see, especially as it resonates through culture and politics in the way that it is, and contributes to making our politics so toxic and so partisan and so destructive. I think there will be change, but I don't honestly see it happening anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I think part of the challenge is that technology has enabled us to curate our own reality, right? So I'm willing to bet, and I haven't seen polling on this, but I'm willing to bet that people view their news source as reliable. In other words, people who read the New York Times think it is reliable, objective news, right? Honest newspapering. People who read, God knows what, people who watch different channels, Newsmax, probably think to themselves, right, this is actually the objective news I've been looking for. This is the problem. It's not that everybody realizes that it is that everybody's living in their own echo chamber. Charles Murray wrote this wonderful book called Coming Apart about this phenomenon that, rich people no longer know poor people. Democrats no longer know Republicans. I wonder to myself, though, you have this optimism, which I am desperate for. Mark says the cure is just leadership. Ronald Reagan will appear from the grave and lead us out of this morass, if only we're going to.
Or not.
Or not. Or not. But
either Ronald Reagan will lead us from the grave, will come from the grave, or Vivek Ramaswamy will emerge to unite this country.
Because it'll be one of those two. Certainly, one of those two is the solution to our problem. But I mean, the question for me is how pervasive it is. Our tendency is to talk about the media, about trusting government, about the stolen election. But you talked about this as well. Is people, for example, who sup at the government trough, right? We have 50% of Americans now, Nick Eberstadt's written really good work on this, 50% of Americans who are getting some form of government assistance. And yet people who get government assistance believe that only the privileged and entitled get government assistance. So, I mean, it's even a divide at that level. Does that come down to this growing perception of income inequality of two Americas? Where does it come from?
It's partly that, and I think you're absolutely right, by the way, Danny, that people do trust institutions that reflect their own views, and people reflect their own views. The most startling example of that, I think I saw recently, was a poll, I think in the last month, that asked Donald Trump supporters whether they trusted him compared with members of their family, their friends, the leaders of their religious institution. They trusted Donald Trump more than all of the other people that they asked about. All of those, your personal friends, members of your family, they trusted Donald Trump. Now, again, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but even I was kind of slightly taken aback by that people, have that level of trust in someone they identify with. On the economic point, you're right. I agree with you both about Charles Murray and Nick Eberstadt have written very well on this. And this is a phenomenon that this increasing, not just polarization, but kind of siloization of America, that people don't, I write about this in the book, and this is my chapter on mutual trust and the collapse in mutual trust. People just don't mix with each other anymore. It's kind of interesting, remember that other book 20 years or so ago, by Robert Kaplan, Bowling Alone, right? Which was this phenomenon of Americans, who still go to bowling alleys, but were not members of bowling leagues anymore, or groups. They were not socializing in the way that classically de Tocqueville described Americans as naturally coming together in groups. And that is true. And I'm sorry to say that since Charles Murray's book, or since that book, Bowling Alone, it's got worse because of social media. We didn't even really have social media back in the early 2000s. That really came about in the teens, and the way in which people now can choose their own community, their own people that they want to be with. And by the way, again, they're not bowling alone, as it were. They're communing, they're communing largely digitally, but they're communing with people who share exactly their views and walling themselves off from anybody else, and whether it be anybody of a different economic background, different interest, different political background, different cultural background, but a different ideological background. They are able to kind of I quote in the book, remember the famous Daniel Patrick Moynihan line, which is that, years ago, you can choose your own opinions, but you can't choose your own facts. That's exactly not true now. You can absolutely choose your own facts. You can choose to completely ignore whatever fact is inconvenient to you, whether it's economics or foreign policy or what's happening in social in social issues. You can I think the only thing you can't. I think the only thing I'm aware of that you can't really ignore is sports scores, right? If you're like I am a New York Giants fan, you cannot convince yourself, however much you may try and may want to, that the New York Giants won their last game when they didn't. But that's kind of like everything else is like you can just choose what you want to believe, and that, of course, that is incredibly divisive. It's incredibly polarizing, and yeah, again, I do end the book on a relatively optimistic note, saying partly because we have been here before, partly because I can see ways in which this can be overcome. But I slightly agree with Mark. I'm not sure about a Ronald Reagan, resurrection, but I do think part of the need here is for leadership, is for genuine national leadership by someone who has real qualities. I think one of the other problems, frankly, we've seen in the last 20 years is a poverty of leadership, a real poverty of leadership. If you go back and look at who we had, whether it was, again, you may not like all their politics, but FDR, Harry Truman, Eisenhower, you can take or leave John F. Kennedy if you like, but LBJ, these were enormously, Nixon for all his flaws, and then of course Ronald Reagan, these were enormously, not always virtuous, but enormous. They had tremendous political virtues. They had great experience. They had great skills. They had great leadership capability. They had an ability to talk to and represent the country. We really haven't had that for the last 20 years. And I think there is a good chance that someone will emerge because America is good at producing these people. To me, looking at where we are today, and we have this choice of the next election, unbelievably between Trump and Biden, you think, how can a country of 340 million produce that? Well, the flip side of that is it is a country of 340 million people. It has produced great leaders in the past, and I think it will do so again.
So how much of this is intentional? Ronald Reagan comes into office in 1980, campaigning on the phrase, the most frightening words in the English language are, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." And, decades later, Americans agree with him. The Supreme Court's collapse in trust is significant. That's as a result of a intentional campaign on the left to discredit the court because they don't like the results that are coming from the court. You have the left with this movement, the critical race theory movement, trying to bring down America and convince Americans that we're a systemically racist country and sort of destroy the common fabric of trust in our Constitution, in our institutions, in our founding. On both the left and the right, there seems to have been a concrete effort to discredit our institutions, and those efforts are succeeding. Is it fair to say that this is the result of an intentional effort in some ways?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I think that's true. And your point about the media and the Supreme Court is particularly striking. I mean, just this relentless campaign, that goes right back to Brett Kavanaugh's, it goes further back than that, actually, of course, goes back to Clarence Thomas's hearing, or even 30 plus years ago. Yeah, this attempt, but yeah, it is a conscious attempt, and you're right too. It's true on the right. I think, some of the things that Donald Trump has said have been intended to, create distrust in institutions, because, again, the problem, I think the particular problem we have is that we have become so polarized and so divided as a country and as a society that there's a willingness for people to believe that. There's a willingness to suspend any skepticism or disbelief or questioning. And when the New York Times publishes something about Clarence Thomas, or Donald Trump says that the media is the enemy of the people, or that the election was stolen, the ground is there for enough people to believe it. There just isn't I hesitate to say this because I think some of the polling contradicts this a little bit, but doesn't seem to be a middle ground, right? This is that where, in the past you always had hyper-partisans, right? People who, would never have, would vote for their party, whatever, yellow dog Democrats, as it were. People would vote for anybody as long as they had a D or an R against their name, and it didn't matter what their character was or what their personality was. But there was a kind of middle ground, which we thought was quite large, where people could be swayed. They would say, okay, well, I'm not I voted for Jimmy Carter in 1976, but country's a mess and a disaster. I'm going to vote for Ronald Reagan I'm going to vote for Ronald Reagan in 1980. That middle ground has shrunk, and that middle ground are persuadable people who can actually say, when a leader is decrying an institution or denigrating an institution, can say, well, actually, this institution is not actually a terrible institution. Maybe it's done some good things. Maybe it's it's part of the constitutional setup of this country, like the Supreme Court, and it's actually very important that we support it. Those people seem to have gone away, and instead we have just these hyper partisans. But again, I think one of the things I talk about in the book a bit in the political section and government is we had one of the weird phenomena we've had in the United States in the last 30 years is not just partisanship, but incredibly narrow polarization. Every single election in this country it's like a 50-50 election. It's a sort of in the history of the country, and indeed in the history, I've looked at this, in the history of almost all Western democracies, it's really weird. We've never had often have a situation where you have this 50-50 split every time. I think I may get these numbers slightly wrong because I don't have them in front of me, but if you look at, I think, like the 8 presidential elections before 1992, something like, I think in 6 of them, the winning candidate won by more than 10 percentage points. You had landslides for George H.W. Bush in 1988, for Reagan in 1984, and to some extent in 1980, for Nixon in 72, for LBJ in 64. These huge majorities. Since 1992, the largest share of the vote any candidate has ever got for president in this country is less than 52%. Barack Obama did it in 2008, about 51.5% of the vote. George W. Bush barely got over 50% of the vote in 2004, and of course lost the popular vote very narrowly in 2000. So we seem to be stuck. We seem to be paralyzed in this 50-50 situation. And the reason I think that's important is when a party loses an election in a landslide, as the Republicans did in 64, or the Democrats did, in 1984, they're forced to kind of rethink who they are and to say, people have rejected us by an overwhelming amount. We've got to change. We've got to start learning some lessons from that, and we've got to move back toward, in both those cases, 64 Republicans, 84 Democrats. We've got to move back towards the center somehow to capture more of those votes. When you have these 50-50 elections, you don't really need to do that anymore. It's kind of like, well, we'll just wait. We need to sort of maximize our turnout a little bit. Things will, we don't need to change. And that's what you've seen. We'll just, for the last 30 years, when parties lose, there was a lot of soul searching in the Republican Party after the 2012 election, which probably took the party, ironically, in completely the wrong direction. But there isn't this political electoral imperative for political parties to have leaders who will come along and say, we've got things wrong and we need to rethink things and we need to start again. Again, Trump did that in 2016 in a very radically different way, but that's rather different from the situation I'm talking about. And even then, he didn't win, of course, either a majority of the popular vote and only won very narrowly in the Electoral College vote. So I think there needs to be some, and I guess where I sort of side with Mark a little bit, some leader who comes along and actually is able to break this deadlock that we have in a way that actually brings more Americans together and makes those who are the losers in that election understand that they have lost and that they really do need to accept that they've lost, which again these days people don't do. And I say this, of course, Trump, refused to accept the result of the 2020 election result. And I think that was very wrong. But, many Democrats did it in 2000, obviously. Many Democrats did it in 2004. We're all familiar with the famous Stacey Abrams, Georgia election. This tendency to say, no, I didn't lose. The result was close and I was cheated out of it. Is bipartisan. Trump took it further than anyone else has done in 2020, but it's bipartisan. I think we need to break that deadlock. I think we need a candidate who comes along and breaks that political deadlock.
Amen. I want to ask you about something, though, that this is my exit question because we've kept you for much longer than we promised. But one of the things that I think we haven't talked about very much is the death of optimism in America. So one of the things that really has characterized both Americans economically, but also the American national character, is this hope in the future. It's what makes us different from Europeans. It really is. We are not fatalists. We are hopeful people who think tomorrow will be a better day. That is no longer really the truth. And while some of that is hype, the reality is the rich have gotten richer at a much faster pace The poor are much more mired in poverty. They have to work much harder to buy a house. I mean, my God, to buy a house is, I think we all know people who simply have, two parents working, a child, and cannot afford to buy a house where they live. This doesn't produce optimism. Do you think that is one of the issues that needs to be dealt with? And then the question, of course, would be, how? That's a good Wall Street Journal exit for you.
I do. I agree with you, Danny. And again, I do talk about this in the book. And I think, another way of thinking about this is what I talked about earlier, inequality and the massive growth of inequality in the country. Again, I'm a capitalist. I firmly believe in capitalism. I firmly believe it's the best system that's ever been created. It's lifted more people out of poverty. But I think right now, American capitalism, I do side with some of those people on the right who think that American capitalism has kind of gone off the rails a little bit. We have too much concentration of power in the hands of too few companies, too much concentration of power results in massive rewards for those who've done well, and then does tend to leave the rest of the country behind. We've had very little real wage growth. I know there's arguments about this, and we can go back and forth about the data. But the median wage in America in the last 20 years has been pretty stagnant. Median real wage, and certainly compared with the compensation of the top 1 or 5% has dramatically declined. And that you're absolutely right, Danny. And the optimism has been demolished, and you can just see this in polls. Again, I constantly return to polling surveys, but people ask, is America on the right track? That question, right track, wrong track question, is America on the right track or the wrong track, has been pretty well negative consistently for more than 20 years. I mean, it began around 2002, 2003, 2001, obviously. There was tremendous unity after 9/11, but it began about 2003, with concerns about what was going on in Iraq, and then from the from the aughts, really up until today, 20 straight years with a couple of months of exception. Large majorities of people saying the country's on the wrong track. Large majorities of people saying now, which is really shocking in American historical terms, their children will have a worse life than they will. That's a really, again, you're absolutely right, Danny. That's not an American feature. Everybody always wants and thinks that their children are going to have a better life than they will. Look, I think this requires economic reforms to make the economy more dynamic. And the other problem is that the U.S. economy has actually, by the way, you look at the rest of the world right now, and the U.S. looks pretty good compared with the rest of the world in economic terms. China's in a mess. Europe's stagnant as it has been. Japan has been stagnant for a long time. But that's not good enough to meet the needs and the hopes and aspirations of the American people. We've had relatively weak productivity growth in this country for 20 years, weak compared to where it was in the 1990s or the 1980s. Although we have low levels of unemployment, we don't have very significant levels of income growth, as I said. Many people's savings have been depleted dramatically. These people don't have much wealth. American people don't have much wealth. So we've got to regenerate economic. We've got to do a lot to regenerate economic growth. I do think that's partly the growth of the size of government has been enormously important in that, and we've got to do something. We've got to rein that back. We've got to do something about the debt that we're building up. We've got to do something about the extent of the lack of dynamism, about the level of tax that we have. So I'm in favor of all of those things. I do think, however, we do need measures to address the particular level, the poverty that we have. But I think that will come about mainly through making America more dynamic. I think the big problem in America right now is not actually that capitalism has failed. It's that we don't have enough capitalism, that we don't actually have enough dynamism. We don't have enough. If you look at the numbers of small businesses that are startups have collapsed in the last 20 years. It's something else I talk about in the book. The dynamism that we used to have has been sapped. We need to get back to the kind of dynamism that we did have in the 1980s, that America did have certainly in the 1950s. We need to do things to get back to that, to lift the economic performance of the country, to make the economic distribution fairer, and to give more hope to more Americans.
And the two institutions that do enjoy majority support are small business and the military that have not suffered that collapse. I'm going to rain on Danny's effort to end this on an optimistic note.
You think that was optimism?
Well, you were trying to. You were trying to find
of
some
low
optimism.
Expectations.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, you've talked about the economic silos that we're living in now, where you have rising inequality, and that's how that's contributing to it. It seems like we're increasingly going to be living in political silos as well. That we've had since 2011. about 35 million Americans have moved from state to state, and most of them moving from blue states to red states. And as a result, we're separating into two Americas increasingly. I mean, one of the reasons why you'll never get Rudy Giuliani elected a new Rudy Giuliani elected in New York to clean up the mess in New York is because all the Republicans who would vote for him or moderates who would vote for him have moved to Florida and Texas, right? And so we're increasingly separating ourselves into a blue America and a red America, living in different realities, listening to different news, believing different alternate facts. Is this only going to get worse as we decamp into our tribal camps? And is there any way to fix that?
Well, and just to rain further on the parade, it's even worse than that, Mark, actually, because it's not. You're absolutely right. Everything you describe is correct, but it's also not just kind of that people are moving to, blue states are becoming bluer and red states are becoming red. It's actually, communities and cities and towns within those states are becoming more concentrated in their political affiliation too. So, I live in New York City. There are, believe it or not, parts of New York City that are actually very Republican, and they're becoming more Republican. Staten Island and parts of the more sort of suburban parts of New York City, whereas the urban parts of all these cities are becoming more and more Democrat as more and more conservatives leave. You're right. So we're becoming very, very, very sort of siloized geographically. And increasingly only kind of interacting with people of the same sort of political background. I will end on this optimistic note. So, and you make the point about you make the point about small business and about the importance of community. I think that it is true that the two institutions that have seen an increase in trust and which are still, well, majorities of Americans still express trust in is the military. I think that's understandable for all kinds of obvious reasons, and small business. And I think if you dig further into that small business question, you get a little bit of a hint of where maybe there is something of a solution, or at least a partial solution here. Because it's not just small business, actually. It's quite interesting. If you ask people, do they trust Congress? Tiny numbers of people say they don't trust Congress. Do you trust your local congressman? Generally speaking, large majorities do. Do you trust the federal government? No. Do you trust your city government, your local? I mean, not in places like New York City, I have to say, but in small towns and cities, generally people do. Do you trust big business? No. Do you trust small business? Yes. And I think part of the problem here, it's only a part of it. I'm not suggesting it's the whole problem, and that therefore solving it will be the whole solution. But part of the problem is this problem of scale and bigness and remoteness that we've got. Yeah, and by the way, social media technology has done that, in spades. I think we've got these huge institutions, huge companies, remote government. We spend all our lives now on social, on looking at television, computer screens and iPhone screens and smartphone screens and everything else. We become distanced, I think, from and there's very interesting work on the collapse of human contact, of social interaction that people have, especially among young people. I think we've all got kids, and my youngest. I've only got one teenager left now. She's almost no longer a teenager, but I've been shocked and actually disturbed the amount of time in the last 5 or 6 years I realize she spends on her own looking at a computer screen. Or an iPhone screen. It's actually terrifying, and you're seeing this social pathologies that have come about as a result of that. I think that, again, to end on an optimistic note, I think that this is becoming such unfortunately, it's such bad news that it will have to change. I think what's happening to young people, the kind of social pathologies that are being visited on young people by technology, this broader sense of alienation from society, from the traditional forms of interaction that we have, I think it's gone too far. And I think more and more people are recognizing that. Parents are recognizing that. Individuals are recognizing that in their own lives. And I think there's going to be a pushback. And so people have got, I don't know how, I can't give you an explanation. I don't think, we're going to ban smartphones, or we're going to, break up Google or whatever, although maybe we will. But I think that there is a broad cultural, by the way, interestingly, also bipartisan backlash. I've got, very liberal, very progressive friends who are as horrified about what's going on in terms of this social disintegration as I am as a conservative. And I think so again, it's not good news. It's probably going to get worse. But I do think, with the history of these things tends to suggest things get worse and worse and worse until people just say enough is enough, and things have got to change, and we've got to turn things around.
Well, there's a hopeful note to end on. Also hopeful that you've written this book, because the first step in solving a problem is diagnosing it, and you've done it brilliantly. And we encourage everyone to go out and get a take and read it. And we'll link to the Amazon page on our Substack.
Thank you
You're
so
very
much.
kind. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks a ton, Jerry. It's always great to have you.
Take care.
Ciao.
All right, Danny, so what do you think?
Well, the thing that I really do worry about deeply is what I talked about at the end, which is that Americans used to be a hopeful people. You worked hard because you knew that you were delivering a better choice, a better future to your family. You worked hard because you knew that if you scraped enough money together, you would buy a little house or a little apartment, and eventually you would pass the money earned from selling that on to your kids, and that was a great idea. And that America is evanescing before our eyes.
I agree with you. And, I question the role of income inequality such as it is in this because, I think the stats are since 1980, the top 1%'s income has risen 226%, while the middle 60%'s income has risen 47%. 47% isn't bad. It would be a problem if the top was rising and the bottom was going down, or the middle was going down. The problem is not that income inequality. Like if a rich person's income goes up 10% and a middle class or a poor person's income goes up 10%, everybody's gone up 10%, but there's more inequality. So inequality is not the issue. The issue is mobility, and the issue is opportunity and whether that's disappearing. And I think it is. I think a lot of people feel that we've unleashed this, and part of this is government. So, the COVID pandemic led to all these lockdowns, which led to all this government spending, which unleashed inflation, which is unleashed, in response to inflation, dramatic increases in interest rates, which means nobody can afford a house anymore.
But Mark, it's not just that nobody can afford a house anymore. It is that, what do elites want people to do? They want them to go to college. You want to go to college? You want to go to a private school college? You're going to spend more than $80,000. Most of the people who work in this country don't make $80,000, let alone have the ability to spend it. Wait, let's go further. Housing costs have skyrocketed because the supply is now so small. Housing costs have skyrocketed even in places where people used to be able to afford a house. I'm not talking about Northern Virginia or or Southern Maryland, where DC people live in $2, $3, $4, $5 million houses. We've seen those changes happening over the last 10 years. I'm talking even about in the heartland where people could spend $100,000, $150,000 and actually buy something. You could buy yourself an outhouse for $150,000 now, but not much more. And that purchasing power, you're right. Income inequality has become a trope, but purchasing power is a real thing. And that, by the way, is not something that is different between Northern Virginia and Central Kansas. You go to the supermarket and you are paying $6 for organic milk, half gallon in Central Kansas and in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, no. So inflation, interest rates, everything, government intervention is making the American dream less achievable for people across the country. If you have to pay 7% interest rate, you're not going to buy a house, even if you could afford the down payment. Even if it is a smaller house, 7% is 7% or whatever the heck the rates are now. No one's going to buy a house with those interest rates, and that's driven by the inflation, which is driven by the government spending, which is driven by the lies about the pandemic. And then you've got the school closures, which have disproportionately affected poor Black and brown kids in these districts, which are shut down much longer. The learning losses will lead to lifetime income losses for these people and put the dream further out of reach for them. So, I understand why trust in government has collapsed, because the government keeps intervening and the government keeps doing things that put the American dream out of reach. And then, oh, by the way, we're not allowed to talk about the American dream anymore because the cultural elites have deemed that we are a systemically racist country and that we need to just blow the whole thing up. And we're not teaching kids, we talk about reading and math scores collapsing in schools. The Nation's Reporter came out and said scores in U.S. history and civics have collapsed. So we're not even teaching our people how to be good citizens anymore. And so it just feels in America like nothing works anymore. Nothing works. Everything's going in the wrong direction. and that's why we're having this collapse in trust in institutions.
Okay, that was a good rant. I am now going to try not to rant, but to help us close out. Look, I think the one piece you left out of that, and we don't talk about it enough, is the $33 trillion in debt. We have Republican and Democrat equal opportunity borrowers we have racked up. And, you know, there were days when people suggested that having a large debt for America was not a bad thing, nothing worth obsessing over, because it was just proof positive that other people wanted to lend us money because we were doing good things and they had confidence in their returns. Now, the payment on that debt is going to become so burdensome to our children and our grandchildren that you really can't make that argument anymore. And I appreciated Nikki Haley bringing that up. I appreciated her slamming all of the previous leaders of our country who have been so cavalier in borrowing that money from the world and from our future. But that has to be a factor too. God, there's so much work to do and so few people to do it.
And so many podcasts.
So many podcasts left to do.
So we're going to keep tackling these problems until we pod them into submission.
Yes. Good luck with that. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.